Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The name of this program is called World Watchers. It's program number 696, April the 8th, 1985. I got a letter from Dan Rather answering my very angry and provocative letter to him regarding the attempted takeover of CBS by Jesse Helms, and Helms will be able to take it over. He and his gang. It's just a matter of time. And I might have mentioned this on the air a few weeks ago. The letter I wrote to Rathers had a reference to his going along with the Kennedy assassination, to describing John Kennedy's head as going forward, indicating the bullet would come from the Texas School Book Depository, as against Kennedy's head being thrown backwards, which would indicate the fatal bullet came from the grassy knoll. And I wrote to him that after playing all the games and playing with the fascists, he wasn't fascist enough, and that one way to stop Jesse Helms in the track, or to try and link him to some of his cohorts in North Carolina would be to investigate the formation of the special forces by Nazi agents that were sent to North Carolina. They were private armies under the direction of Frank Wiesner and Allen Dulles, and it was out of Frank Wiesner's office that Wesley Liebler took care of the Warren Commission part on the Belarusian Russians from Minsk, and the CIA agents working with Allen Dulles from the Central Intelligence Agency. And in 1981, broadcast number 512, I referred to Dr. Michael Akhmeteli, Achmeteli, and Dr. Franz Seix and Dr. Emil Augsburg, who was head of Eichmann's Jewish problem, getting rid of the Jews in Europe, and how the Special Army was founded in 1952 by Eisenhower, who worked with the Dulles brothers, and these special forces became the nucleus of death squads and partaking in coups and trouble, destabilization around the world. And their origin with the Nazis was and is in North Carolina. And a year later, in November of 1982, I referred to a Washington Post article, Helpful Nazis Who Evaded Justice. And this goes into these same gentlemen and how they worked with William Colby and set up the Phoenix program, the Nazis from Germany, and worked for Radio Liberty and Radio Free America as U.S. instructors, and were at Fort Holabird, where the Nazi medical and mind experiments began. And I also referred to the material of James Frankenberry, saying that the plans for killing John Kennedy and for shooting in General Walker's window were arranged in North Carolina, and suggested that maybe 60 Minutes or CBS could do a little bit about what's going on in North Carolina because of the relationship of these people to Jesse Helms. Well, I got a letter dated March the 8th, 1985 from Dan Rather. Dear Mrs. Brussell, this is simply to say, personally and directly, thank you for your words of support and encouragement. They are appreciated more than any short note can express. And so is your understanding that even while we sometimes make mistakes, the CBS Evening News is dedicated to accuracy and fairness. Please be assured we will continue to do our best to report the news without fear or favor, and to be worthy of your confidence. Well, I didn't say that they were fair, and I didn't say they were accurate, and I also didn't say I had confidence in them. What I said was that there was something worse than them that was going to swallow them up, and that being inaccurate and being unfair in the news, and carrying that Oswald did it alone on the 20th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, that they were hiding Nazis and fascists who wouldn't like other things that they do, that they had protected the fascists, and that's why they were in trouble now. I will send them some material on this, some more material, and hopefully maybe 60 Minutes would go into the area of those Nazis from Germany and how they affected America by setting up these special teams that usurp the regular army and are sent out to places like Grenada to overthrow particular countries and go behind the lines to stir up trouble in these various countries. Now, the takeover of the news media and the attempted takeover and the merger is a very big story, and of course it affects all of us in many ways, and I'll just try and give you some articles and some examples. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article April the 4th, 1985, this past week. MCI Communications Corporation agreed that they would back cable news network Ted Turner in their hostile bid to take over CBS. MCI spokesman Gary Tobin said that there is no truth to the New York Times report that said MCI has agreed to give Turner $50 million to help make the bid for CBS, but MCI did attend a meeting in New York with investment bankers, and the topic of CBS came up, and MCI officials left the meeting. They didn't make a commitment or reach an agreement, but the subject was brought up on how to help Ted Turner and Jesse Helms take over CBS. Meanwhile, former Treasury Secretary William Simon would not comment on the same report, which said that he agreed to back Ted Turner by giving him $50 million to help finance a hostile bid for CBS. Now, William Simon, of course, is a Knight of Malta, along with William Casey, and we'll get into the ABC takeover in 1 second. William Simon works closely with Helionetics. He resigned from the board because of various stock scandals, but with Edward Teller and Daniel Graham of the Star Wars contracts, and also he was in charge of the Olympics this past year, working with Western Goals and John Sing Lau and the Los Angeles Police Department, the computers into the police departments. Simon's name has come up many, many times regarding the inside secret government team. So it's interesting that Simon is part, with his links to Edward Teller and Western Goals and these various police state organizations that want to create the first strike offensive up through the Star Wars and down to the police recruitment and list of names from past computers and present computers, that he is linked directly and indirectly to all of this, that he is part of the bid to take over CBS for Jesse Helms and working with Ted Turner on that. Michael Novak, who's on CNN, a regular reporter now, replaced Thomas Buchanan, is another Knight of Malta along with William Simon, and I've mentioned the others many times. But the CBS management has been fighting for its independence, and the latest person to get into this team to attack CBS happens to be none other than William Simon, the close buddy of J. Peter Grace and Claire Lewis and Alexander Haig and the entire William Buckley, the whole Knight of Malta team, all wanting to take over CBS network at this time. It hasn't happened yet, but when you get William Simon and other elements being willing to put up the money, it's just a matter of days before that falls. But before CBS could fall, ABC went into the hands of none other than William Casey and the Central Intelligence Agency. And William Casey is a Knight of Malta also, so that would be two major networks in the hands of the Vatican agents, whose oath is to the Vatican, to Rome, to the Roman Empire. Tuesday, March 19th, the New York Times had a long story. ABC is being sold for $3.5 billion. This is the first network sale, and the front page of the New York Times referred to capital cities buying ABC, and in big letters it says little known media company in a surprise takeover bid for broadcasting giant. Well, why should capital cities be little known when the truth is that our CIA director formed that in 1954, and he has kept it not in a blind trust but very active until this year. And along with the confirmation hearings of Casey, isn't it interesting that he has so much to do with communications and newscasting, and that this has never been brought up until he and his company could gobble up an entire broadcasting station, ABC Broadcasting. I got a letter from a friend in Kansas who said, no wonder there's not much news in our paper, because it says that Mr. Casey's holdings in capital cities owns the Kansas City Times and the Kansas City Star, and his holdings are worth about $7.5 million in capital cities. That article says the CIA chief offers to put capital cities stock into his blind trust. Here's the director of the CIA who didn't want to put any of his stocks in blind trust. He goes ahead and they buy ABC, the station that Howard Hughes wanted to buy 20 years ago. And I'll make those connections to the Central Intelligence Agency in one moment. But here is Casey. Hughes wasn't a member of the Vatican or a Knight of Malta, but Casey is. And so his links to William Simon and his intent to take over CBS and the Vatican to take away from the old original Jewish broadcasters is now happening. Just as in Hollywood they could take away the studios from Warner Brothers and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Louis Mayer, and swing them into the hands of the intelligence community. And also I want to bring up Mr. Rupert Murdoch buying 50% of 20th Century Fox. But the article from Kansas says the CIA director William Casey said Wednesday he was willing to put his stock in Capital Cities Communication in blind trust after they reached an agreement to take over ABC television network. Now he'll put in a blind trust that was established in 1983, but his broadcasting was not, his interests were not in a blind trust. Capital Cities planned the merger with ABC, and that has raised questions about the propriety of the CIA director owning a large stake in one of the three major television networks. Now, if you own all the newspapers, if the CIA and the Knights of Malta own the newspapers, then the newspapers aren't even bring up this propriety. But even in Kansas City, they said Mr. Casey's holdings in Kansas are the Kansas City Times, the Kansas City Star, and Mr. Casey withheld Capital City stock from his blind trust in 1983 because the government ethics regulations don't permit such a trust to include a holding amounting to more than 20% of the official's entire portfolio, the CIA spokesman said. The trust was set up after criticism of his stock dealings while heading the Central Intelligence Agency. His Capital City stock is worth more, his dividend shares last year of $250,000. His wife's dividends were worth $100,000 to $250,000. They received dividends up to $6,000, which would be the annual yield of 30,000 shares. The stock was trading Wednesday at $205 per share, putting a possible value of Casey's holdings as more than $6 million. The Capital Cities holdings are prompting questions because the conglomerate wants the approval of its takeover of ABC, which had been a target of the CIA criticism before it was taken over about some of its reporting. The CIA had filed a formal complaint with the Federal Communications last November, remember, saying that ABC violated a fairness doctrine when they said that the CIA planned to kill a Honolulu investment counselor, that was Mr. Rewald, who revealed the spy agency was involved in his company. It was the first such complaint by the government agency against a broadcaster. The CIA filed a complaint against ABC. The Federal Communications favored with the broadcasting station, so in comes the CIA and then buys the broadcasting station so you won't get any more stories on Rewald. The article says the Federal Communication rejected that, and last month the CIA asked the Federal Communication to take another look. The agency had charged ABC with intentional news distortion and asked that FCC consider the matter when ABC's valuable radio and TV licenses are up for renewal. Mr. Casey was one of the founders of Capital Cities Communication, and it owns newspapers, radios, televisions, and cable TV systems. He only resigned from the board in 1981. He'd been the CIA director for starting in January of 81, so he couldn't be actively on the board, but he could make decisions, and he was one of the founders of the station. Another article from Newsday in New York, March 19th, 1985, a capital acquisition. In hindsight, Capital Cities Communications has been getting involved in really big time for some years. Its acquisition of American Broadcasting will put it up there with the multi-billionaires of the communication industries, such as LA Times, and Mr. Murphy, and the CIA is one of the bigwigs of LA Times, plus a lot of other people, and they refer to the Gannett and Newhouse newspapers. Within its corporate girth, there are such goodies as 7 television and a dozen radio stations, a number of trade publications, 50 cable television stations, 10 newspapers, several penny savers, and even a monthly financial newsletter. All of this on the board. The founder of this was William Casey, the Knight of Malta, the protege of William Donovan, a special knight by the Vatican, all of them knighted around the time that Reinhard Galen and James Angleton were knighted. This article goes on, Cap Cities probably enjoys the highest reputation for management among the broadcasters, the investment firm said. They were able to gobble up the bigger fish, and they will be able to run it efficiently. In revenues last year of $939 million, they had TV stations in key markets such as Philadelphia, Houston, Texas, Hartford and New Haven, Connecticut, Buffalo, New York. That's the home base of Mr. Erlanger, the top Nazi with his South American Nazi connections with Dr. Stuart Bryan and Mrs. Edwin Meese, and the investment into the biotech companies, and also Buffalo, New York, Jack Kemp from New York City, one of the most conservative congressmen. There's TV stations I'm sure get favorable play or keep these other stories off the news. Raleigh, North Carolina, Jesse Helms' backyard. Fresno, California. Tampa, Florida. You know, the various scandals and associations that have been going on wildly down in Tampa. It also owns the Fairchild Publication newspaper that puts out Women's Wear Daily for 10 daily newspapers, including the Star Telegram in Fort Worth, the Times and Star in Kansas City, the Oakland Press in Pontiac, Michigan. And the acquisition has stuck in its throat. The one acquisition that stuck in its throat was the Wilkes-Barre Times Leader, which it bought in 1978. Amid charges of union busting, the paper's employees went on strike, started a newspaper of their own, the Citizen's Voice. The union paper is now the dominant paper in town, and William Casey's newspaper was doing the union busting. Cap Cities was founded by the late Lowell Thomas. I always understood that Lowell Thomas worked with the OSS and CIA. In fact, I saved as many books as I could about his trips and explorations and so forth. Because of his background with the intelligence community, it was founded by Lowell Thomas and CIA Director William Casey. Casey sold off a lot of his interest last year and resigned as the company director when he joined the CIA. Well, he didn't sell off much if he still owns $7 million or $6 million worth. How much more did he have? But he founded this, and this story when Capital Cities bought ABC, the New York Times, is little-known company, and our CIA director founded it, and it has all of these stations and can influence so many cities around the country. And with so much printed material, how did they throw it off for the first 24 hours as little known? Then there was another story in the New York Post, March 23rd. Capital Cities Communication will sell its New Haven, Connecticut station to satisfy the federal communication regulations governing the $3.5 billion takeover of ABC. Thomas Murphy, Cap Cities chairman, explained the signal from Cap Cities, New Haven, overlaps with the signal of WABC flagship station there. Cap Cities has previously announced it will sell its Buffalo station to meet potential FCC objections to that. So their stations are now overlapping. And then there was another story in Newsday. CIA director wants to place his material in trust. That's similar to the Kansas City story, that he wants to put his holdings into trust. And it goes into the question of this article of his having interest in the news media and now being so much part of ABC. In quotes, the prospect of the CIA director holding an interest in one of the nation's three major television networks has raised questions. The Center of National Security Director Morton Halpern, a former National Security staff member in the Nixon administration, he was one of those bugged by Henry Kissinger, has commented, in quotes, a government official should not be part of the news media. But this gentleman, through Nixon and Watergate, the Nixon administration, once the Kennedys were killed and out of office and Nixon and Reagan were in, he's been a large part of the news media all this time. And as I say, it hasn't been in blind trust. And he not only is a part of it, but he founded it and has a huge investment. And in fact, this article says he would take his $7.5 million interest in it and put it into a blind trust. Don't you think that is a little late? And then finally, there was a story in the Register Guard from Eugene, Oregon, about William Casey's $7.5 million and how he got this started way back, and his financial disclosures with the Office of Government Ethics left out in 1984. It shows that he owned more than 250,000 worth of capital cities, the maximum range on the standardized form, but he actually owes up to $7 million, and it was not in blind trust. So that is Mr. Casey of our CIA, a Knight of Malta from the Vatican, a chief spook and a fellow traveler along with Mr. William Donovan in the espionage network set up after World War II with both the Nazis and British intelligence, and holding so much in the news media and now becoming the owner actually of the major amount of stock, his company buying ABC. Another article about ABC called Grand Slam from the New York Post. Donald Trump was holding the right trump card last week when Capital Cities merged with ABC. He's one of ABC's biggest stockholders. Trump is a multimillionaire in New York City. Trump, according to our sources, will stand to make $47 million on the takeover. But the builder with the Midas touch wasn't motivated by profit in this case. He started quietly buying up ABC stock a year and a half ago after he got the New Jersey Generals franchise because he felt the network was treating the USFL badly, and the fledgling league, and it's represented by Trump's lawyer. The lawyer for that league is Roy Cohn. He had filed a $1.3 billion antitrust suit against the other NFL team, claiming it has stranglehold on network contracts. So Mr. Trump has lawyer Roy Cohn. Now, Roy Cohn is on the board of Western Goals, and William Simon, being the head of the Olympic Committee, used Western Goals and Larry McDonald, the late Larry McDonald, for computers, allegedly for violence at the time of the Olympics, but he worked very hard with that team of Admiral Moore, John Singlaub of the World Anti-Communist League, the same John Singlaub I was talking about the past 3 weeks with his links to the American Security Council, mercenary magazines, and World Anti-Communist League, and also the Western Goals connections. So Roy Cohn on the board of Western Goals and working with the Central Intelligence Agency all of his life, and being the attorney for Mr. Trump, who started a year ago. Now, I'm sure that Mr. William Casey knew that his capital cities was going to get ready to buy up ABC. It would take a year to plan all that. So Mr. Trump is getting his shares and putting away $47 million. Roy Cohn is his attorney, and while William Simon, their co-worker, is offering or working to get the bucks to put up CBS, Roy Cohn and this gang are working. Mr. Trump and William Casey are all part and parcel of this activity, and now they will, I'm sure, get their favorable broadcasting for the football teams that go on every week or whatever it is. That behind these broadcasting teams are the same characters that I've been talking about in various activities of counterintelligence and links to the Vatican. Roy Cohn's partner, Mr. Boland, his law partner, is a Knight of Malta. And as I say, the power is now going to the Roman Empire, the newsprint, and it's becoming more clear all along how these various teams integrate and consolidate their power. It comes, every few months a new story comes that links them all together one more time. Now, the New York Times had a large story you can get from the libraries, March 24th, 1985, and now the media mega merger. And it talks about capital cities, how Time Magazine bought up, that's Time, Life, Fortune, Sports Illustrated bought up Southern Living and other regional magazines of February this year for $480 million. Gannett Publications just bought the Des Moines Register and other newspapers and made their holdings more consolidated with another $200 million. And Rupert Murdoch has just plunked in, and we'll go into that, 50% of 20th Century Fox. He really has a control to take over now if he wants from Marvin Davis. He's plunked this money down that Davis needed very badly. The New York Times story goes into the various mergers that are taking place and has a chart of the mega mergers, but it's very important to follow the cast of characters as they condense their power, who they're pushing out, and who is taking over from them. And the New York Times mentions Capital Cities was founded in 1954 by a group of businessmen who bought a UHF television station in Albany, New York. 3 years later, they bought a second TV in Durham, North Carolina, also a capital city, and the acquisition was the genesis of the company's name, Capital Cities. And it doesn't mention in the New York Times, this long, long article, a single word about William Casey. That came out in the small newspapers. The New York Times didn't have a word, maybe later, but in the beginning about Capital Cities. They described it as a company that just began in this city and then in that city, not by the man who was knighted by the Vatican or became the CIA director who worked with Robert Vesco and Fred Fielding and Richard Nixon and John Mitchell through the whole Watergate scandal, came out untouched, ran Ronald Reagan's campaign, and then became CIA director. Now, one more article just finally on this ABC stock thing, and then I want to go into the Howard Hughes connections to ABC. The exchange tunes into ABC stock. This is from the New York Daily News, that the New York Stock Exchange will read and analyze and determine if there's an investigation warranted that anybody might have profited unfairly or illegally from advanced knowledge about company developments. Now, this gentleman in New York City who owns all this property with Roy Cohn, he's Mr. New York City practically, Donald Trump. They're never going to say, when he started buying this stuff up a year and a half ago, that there's any connection. They're not going to connect Roy Cohn to the Central Intelligence Agency, to William Casey, even though he's part of their right arm since the prosecuting days of the Rosenbergs and the Alger Hiss case, the House of Un-American Activities. They won't find any connection. So what they'll look for, they're not going to scratch any surfaces, and of course it'll go through as being completely clean. Nobody gained, and ABC is now owned by the company that William Casey started in the 1950s. Now, in the book on Howard Hughes that Michael Drosnin wrote, he has a section on Howard Hughes trying to buy up ABC. And at the time, the thing that stopped Howard Hughes from buying it was that he was going to have to appear personally. The Federal Communications wanted him to appear if he had the controlling stock of ABC. Now, this was in 1968. Howard was never seen after 1966. And the story, of course, in Drosnin's book is that Hughes was thinking of taking over ABC, and it mentions his attorney, Greg Bouncer, and he called Greg Bouncer that he was nervous that he'd have to appear. The common denominator between the CIA and the Hughes organization, ABC, has been, well, there's a lot of them, but one is Greg Bouncer, who was working with the CIA and working with Hughes, and is an attorney for ABC Broadcasting. There's an article reprint of the book, and I also have the book on Citizen Hughes, and it tells that Robert Mayhew, who worked for Howard Hughes, he also, as I said before, never saw Howard Hughes, was called by Howard, and said, what will I do? That they will insist that I have to appear in public. And he wrote Mayhew's a note, I want you to know confidentially and most accurately just how significant a position in the formulation of U.S. opinion would be afforded by the acquisition of ABC. I want you to tell me confidentially. Now, Howard Hughes, who set the world record on flying planes with speed, inventing planes, working for the government, used aircraft, Lockheed, helping instrumental in many of the technical parts of the airplane field, and also using publicity for movie promotion, he doesn't have to write a memo to Mayhew telling information, asking him for information on how important would it be to form U.S. opinion if I acquired ABC. The memo was written in 1968, June 30th, 68. The Democrats had been completely absorbed by the Hughes organization. John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were dead. Martin Luther King was dead. And they had everything they wanted, and the newspapers were in the palm of their hand anyway. So he is acting allegedly through memos that goodness knows who he is, Vance Cooper, or the dummy people around him that were simulating the Howard Hughes memos, were making the proposition that he wanted to buy up the stock. And then ABC had a lawsuit, an injunction. And according to Michael Drosnin, Hughes was so frightened by the lawsuit that he was ready to abandon his network ambitions if they would promise to drop the litigation. And up till now, there was no issue about buying the stock, but Hughes had to appear. And there's an interesting memo where he says, he writes about ABC, and he writes to Greg Boutzer, and he said, at the hearing today or tomorrow, ABC will demand my appearance. This will bring into sharp focus all the old rumors of my death, disability, etc. And therefore, if for any reason the deal fails to materialize, people will say what the reason was my unwillingness to appear. I'll continue and analyze that statement. We'll take a 1-minute break and continue the second half of this program and talk about Hughes' appearance or disappearance and the takeover of ABC. This is Mae Brussell. It is side 2 of broadcast number 696. The program is called World Watchers, April the 8th. It is now 1985. Getting back to the quotations from Citizen Hughes, the book of Citizen Hughes by Michael Drosnin, Howard Hughes was ready through the judges and the Justice Department to win over antitrust suits and implications because he already had substantial cable TV ownership and holdings, and he had, in quotes, a wide range of electronics equipment, manufactured communications satellites, and he owned KLAS in Las Vegas, Nevada. As he was prepared to throw in the towel, and he was afraid that he would have to appear, Hughes was deploying a growing platoon of lawyers and fixers and bagmen to help him take over ABC, and he wanted to get former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg to handle the legal conflicts, and he wanted to work with Lyndon Johnson, who, according to this story, also felt that the TV was biased and it wouldn't be a bad idea. But as he swung into the final days of his 2-week crusade, Hughes had all kinds of strategies ready and set for him. But then it goes on, when all the papers were counted and he had 1.6 million shares, more than a third of the outstanding stock in ABC, they still insisted that he would have to appear in person for the Federal Communications to grant the license. It was the one thing he could not do. He was informed on Monday night the FCC would definitely demand his appearance. Now, we're talking about 1968, and I said that Hughes was never physically seen from 1966 until from the Boston hospital where he had brain surgery, and then was taken to Greece, and he was dead by 1971. And this book covers a period of 1966 to 1970 where he was completely faceless and as a ghost. But when he was told on Monday that he would definitely have to appear, the FCC said that noon on July 16, 1968, a formal statement was issued. Hughes rejected the stock and his bid to take over ABC to have a network of his own. Now, I always said that the Howard Hughes organization from 1966 on, or earlier even, was the beginning of the Nazification of America, that this faceless person was controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. Robert Mayu, the agent in charge of the Hughes connections and communications during this period, was from the FBI and the counterintelligence group, along with William Casey. And it would have been nice to have this faceless person be able to buy that major network, but the condition was that he had to be seen. And he brings up the issue, or it's quoted in the book, that nonsensical quotation, well, if I don't show up, it'll bring up the rumors of my death. Well, that's all the more reason, if he just goes into a room one day and they see him, then the rumors of his death stop. But the fact that he wanted it and didn't show up should increase the rumors of his death. But because the CIA and the intelligence community already own so much of the news media, and heaven help us, as they take a tighter stranglehold, nobody hardly ever brought up the question of his death until the time of Watergate in 1972, when Congressman Rosenthal and others went to declare him legally dead. Now, a world watcher, a friend in New York, just gave me last week a book review from 1966 on Howard Hughes. It was written by John Keats. This was a long time ago. That was 2 years before he was trying to buy up ABC. That book came out. 1966 was the last year that Howard was ever physically seen. And just this quick book review is in the New York Times, just to give you the essence of what they were saying to Howard, about Howard before he was wanting to buy so hard the ABC network. It says, Howard Hughes, like the faltering titan in a Hollywood mock epic, Howard Hughes has slowly, perhaps deliberately, allowed the power that money can buy to slip through his fingers. Holed up in a tightly guarded Bel Air mansion known to outsiders as San Limbo, he no longer makes movies or designs planes or controls exclusive patent rights to oil drilling bit invented by his father that has gushed a steady stream of millions since 1908. He has surrendered ownership of the Hughes aircraft, a huge and usually successful electronics firm, to an institute for medical research, and too late for this first full-length biography to have included, he recently gave up a 6-year legal struggle to recover control of Trans World Airlines by selling his shares for $566 million. Now, in 1966, when this book was written, Howard, wherever he was, and at that point he was taken by Robert Mayu and John Rosselli to the Boston hospital, had just received the cash of $566 million. He gave up everything else, his airplanes, his designs, his patent, his oil bit. He surrendered everything, the used aircraft, and now he's going into a Boston hospital for head surgery, accompanied by John Rosselli of the Mafia and Robert Mayu of counterintelligence of CIA and FBI, holding $556 million. Those are the millions that bought up the Las Vegas tables and brought in Intertel and the other network that took over after Howard. But this review of the book just simply mentions in 1966 how he was divesting himself of everything, and it's interesting, if he was doing all that, why he was so determined to control politicians and control ABC Network in 1968. Or again, I ask, after 1968, when there's no longer Hughes, if they could have pulled it without you seeing Hughes, then the CIA would have bought ABC in 1968 instead of 1985. Also, a quotation from Michael Drosnin's book. He's getting a lot of publicity on this book from the LA Weekly. They asked him how he happened to go after the story, and Drosnin said, I didn't set out to go after the Hughes story. I always said there were two things I wouldn't be a part of, the Kennedy assassination and the Howard Hughes story. I saw them both as bottomless pits, no way to unravel these stories, so he claimed he was looking for information on the Glomar Explorer. The men who ran Counterspy in Washington, D.C., an investigative magazine that had some very good articles, stated that one of the gentlemen stated he would never go into the Kennedy assassination or Jonestown because those were black holes or bottomless pits. So it's interesting how, in writing this book with Robert Mayhew's links to these various possibilities of the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King under the Hughes umbrella of the counterintelligence, and with Guy Bannister, the links of Mayo to Bannister, many, many links to the assassination of Kennedy. Drosnin said there are two things he wouldn't touch, the Kennedy assassination and the Howard Hughes, and really his book is an avoidance, a total avoidance of the Howard Hughes story. Now, in the past few weeks, in addition to William Simon getting in the act with Ted Turner and Jesse Helms to try and take over CBS, and William Casey and his company and the communications network taking over ABC, Mr. Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch, bought 50% of 20th Century Fox. That's the studio that I have followed for a long time with you and shared information about Marvin Davis. He took Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger off the board recently, although they get certain salaries for going to the meetings. And of course, William Rogers of the State Department is still on the board, and the late Grace Kelly. And Joseph Skank of 20th Century Fox, one of the original founders, was a Knight of Malta, active with the Vatican, and it was 20th Century Fox that gave the original land to Ronald Reagan, the $2 million that made him a wealthy man, that got him started with material wealth, and a ranch in California came through 20th Century Fox. Now, the last time I was talking about Rupert Murdoch, the last few times, one, he owns the London Times that put out the story of the Hitler Diary. All that happened with that was payment was made of $3 million to the Waffen-SS, the Nazi link to the Odessa organization, to Otto Skorzeny's group, the late Skorzeny, and the living Nazis that were Adolf Hitler when he died, and up through the current Nazi network organization. They get old and their children need money, I guess, to go to college or whatever. And there's a fund called the Hague, H-I-A-G, of the Waffen-SS. Well, the $3 million that came from Der Spiegel and from London Times went to the Waffen-SS. That trial is still going on in Europe, and I have to update you on the news on that trial. And also, at the time of the Grenada invasion and when Edwin Meese was under examination and a few newspapers were asking questions about Edwin Meese, not many, it was Murdoch who flew into Chicago and plunked down something like $50 million and bought the Chicago Sun with the statement. Mike Royka had it on Phil Donahue's program. Remember, I talked about it. There'll be no more talk about Edwin Meese and no more talk about Grenada. And so that is the power he has. Murdoch came in. He has a lot of holdings. He keeps compiling new holdings. He recently bought Ziff Davis Publications for $350 million. The New York Times had a breakdown of the holdings of Mr. Murdoch. In case you wonder about it, his News Corporation, the Australian parent company, that's where he came from, is one of his major holdings, the Cruden Investment, the Murdoch family holding. Then he has the News Corp Investment, British holding company, News Limited, Australian holding company, News Investments, British company, News International, the Arnset Transport Company, 50% holding, Australian subsidiaries, 51 operating companies, 27 newspapers, Channel 10 in Sydney, Australia, Channel 10 in Melbourne, and its British subsidiaries are 28 operating companies, including the News Group, which is the Sun, that's the and the News of the World, and then the Times newspaper, the London Times, the Sunday Times, satellite television, and its American subsidiaries. There's 10 operating companies: the New York Post, the Boston Herald, the Express News, Village Voice, Chicago Sun-Times, San Antonio, the Express, the Star, the New York Magazine, New Women Magazine, Travel Weekly Magazine, and then 10 other magazines he recently acquired, as I say, from Ziff Davis last November. Now, he came in with a hunk of money. Mark Rich was bought out after his criminal investigations. He was the partner of Marvin Davis and 50% partner. He bought in with Marvin Davis at 20th Century Fox. And Mr. Murdoch plunked down this money and hidden between the lines, according to the New York Times, of the discussion of Marvin Davis and Mr. Murdoch is how much the decisions will be made by Murdoch now that he's come in and rescued Marvin Davis. What will the tone of the studio be like? Well, that's a good question, given his desire to plunk $50 million to stop talk of Edwin Meese. You can imagine the propaganda and the kind of material or the movies that they'll be making. Their recent movies were horrendous. They were losing money by the millions. The Taste of Marvin Davis and Henry Kissinger and Jerry Ford isn't so great with what Americans need in way of entertainment, but he does own this particular empire. And now he's moved to Hollywood, and of course 50% of that owning, a good hunk of it, is up here at Pebble Beach. They own Pebble Beach and part of Monterey and Seaside. Now, the Counter Spy magazine, many of you have it. If you don't, you should take it. They've changed their title to National Reporter. And just this last issue came out, their first with a new title, Winter 1985, and it's about Tufts University and the CIA infiltration or takeover of the Foreign Service and the Law School Department. And the reason I bring it up now is that Murdoch's name comes into this article because a director of the CIA was recruiting at Tufts there at Medford, Massachusetts. This was last October, and 25 students had a protest and stopped them from being allowed to speak. And they tried to show the people in charge of the university how the CIA had lied to the American people and broken the policies, violated campus recruitment activities, their promises. For example, they say they're going to be truthful. They've lied on different points. And the point is that the students were temporarily suspended and they were apprehended but allowed to continue as undergraduates, but the CIA could not recruit. They were temporarily suspended recruiting undergraduates until they could determine if university policies had been defeated. What this article goes on to say is that while the university officials were going over the confrontational policies of students versus CIA recruitment on campus, the Boston Herald, it goes on to say, the local Rupert Murdoch paper was outraged that the university would listen to the students and not slam on them for their stopping the CIA. It said the Boston Herald, the local Rupert Murdoch paper, was outraged enough to run a lead editorial titled "Toughs Wimps Out" with its CIA ban. What they were doing was stopping the CIA recruitment on the campus while they went over the policies of the CIA, and they referred to U.S. ambassadors who were part of the CIA activity, who had graduated from the university's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Mr. Thomas Pickering from El Salvador, Dean Hinton, and Robert White, and much of the school is known for their CIA Foreign Service, their law department, the CIA, and undergrads and grads being recruited as undergrads and going over to Washington, D.C. for interviews to go into the CIA. So the point is that even in a town like Medford, Massachusetts, where there's a large enclave of future CIA students, the influence of Murdoch, of Rupert Murdoch, shows up in the editorials of the paper of cracking down on the university for even listening to the arguments of the students. So this gentleman, with all these holdings, is able to influence the politics of the local neighborhoods in ways that we can't even imagine. Another gentleman who is growing in his influence in the news media is Reverend Moon. And recently he had a convention of 400 people, news people, invited to South Korea to look favorably upon Moon and Moon Organization. And the head of the Washington Times, the editorial head for Moon, said the way to control the world, or to paraphrase it, is to control the minds of the people, and that the newspapers would be doing that. Now, Newsday had a story, March 28, 1985, the mainstreaming of the Reverend Moon. And this is a long article by the religious writer, 3 pages, saying that more than $500,000 in funding has been put up for a new conservative political religious relations group called the Coalition of Religious Freedom, led by evangelical Baptist preacher working with the Mooney Church. And this article is long, big letters, seeking respectability, and how the Moonies are reaching out and they don't like to be a cult, and that their property and their programs, valued at more than $10 million a year, is subsidized by church income from industries and fundraising from Japan and South Korea that is poured into our country. Now, in the past 3 weeks, Mr. Arnaud de Borchgrave, who has been one of the main factors of disinformation with Michael Ledeen and Mr. Pazienza and Claire Sterling, in lies about Italy, about the Pope shooting, about terrorism around the world, Mr. Arnaud de Borchgrave has been made the editor of the Washington Times, bringing with him the Rome desk, the connections to Licio Gelli, to the P2, to the Knights of Malta, all the Italian fascist connections that go into the intended plans to have a military junta in Italy that didn't take place in 1981, and to try and link the Pope's shooting to the Russian, Bulgarian connections. All of these parts are working with Mr. de Borchgrave, who now becomes the editor of Reverend Moon's paper. And this article, Seeking Respectability, goes at great length into how Reverend Moon is becoming legitimate, and he's getting himself accepted by the religious leaders around the world. It says, over the past decade, the church has spent millions of dollars on interdisciplinary conferences for scientists. Now they're doing it for newspaper people, editors, and publishers. This church began seriously courting other church ministers last year following Moon's incarceration. Hundreds of ministers have been invited to conferences sponsored by the church directly or by CAUSA, C-A-U-S-A, a church-funded anti-communist institute. And of course, Mr. Moon and CAUSA work closely with John Singlaub of Western Goals and the World Anti-Communist League, and the material that I've had on the air for the last 3 weeks of these interconnections go closely to Moon and his relationship to conservative organizations who want to turn the world Christian. And the article says most people reject Moon's theology, but they accept his strident anti-communism, and they're finding that evangelical Christians are joining with Moonies as their strange bedfellows, but they're blending together their anti-communism and unification theology. And Mr. Bello, who heads a group called South Carolina Citizens for Morality, says that after church leaders questioned him on his influence in South Carolina, they offered him a $150,000 donation for his ministry, and he works with the Moonies, and money is coming from all kinds of organizations. The evangelical, the far right, the Vatican are blending with Reverend Moon at all these different levels because of their violent anti-communism. This article goes on to say that when Terry Dolan, the founder of the National Conservative Political Action Committee, accepted $500,000 from Moon sources to start a new anti-communist organization, he was criticized by what he called the Christian right, who are nervous about the connections. But he feels comfortable with that, and Paul Weyrich, a conservative who formed the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, questioned what Moon might be asking Dolan in return. Weyrich, of course, is a Catholic and helped fund Jerry Falwell, and he sees that Moon is funding Dolan, and all of them seem to be getting in the same big mattress or waterbed together. This article says some church groups are warning their clergy to avoid Moon conferences and are urging them to discard their information kits. Leaders in the United Methodist Church and the Evangelical Free Church of America urge members to erase videotapes sent from the Unification Church and their information kits. But Moon is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, recently $500,000, with tape cassettes and lectures for the various churches around the country to help him and them in this fight against anti-communism, so that pouring in to Central America and around the world, and in all the major countries and minor countries too, is this violent form of anti-communism and repression of people at the same time, that the whole goal is through the will of Christ or whatever it is, they have a common bind to keep the status quo in these various countries, while the people that run these shows have unlimited wealth to do whatever they want. And regarding just one final point on this news media story and the takeovers here, regarding the MGM and Alexander Haig being put on the board of MGM, he had a big role in having that movie Red Dawn made, that violent anti-communist movie. And New Times, the magazine from the Soviet Union, mentioned that helping with the filming of this movie, actually doing the gore splashing sequences, and the gifted actors that were professional mercenaries, they used the Soldier of Fortune publisher Robert K. Brown, who's a close friend of the man who produced the movie, John Milius. And to make Red Dawn, they used the actual anti-communist Soldier of Fortune mercenaries to make this very authentic, how the Russians would be taking over the United States. And it refers to various people, a pair of intrepid paratroopers who, after rehearsing in Honduras, were instructing the Nicaraguan Contras and how to dynamite fodder storages and how to murder children and ambush people. Then these two show up, and they're not the only mercenaries who sold their talent to Hollywood. At the annual Jamboree of Professional Mercenaries in Las Vegas, they encountered their old pals who recently had been perspiring before the cameras. They were military consultants for the notorious Soldier of Fortune magazine and gave stories about the mercenaries and worked for Robert Brown and helped with that movie. And then, of course, as soon as that movie was made, Alexander Haig, on the board of MGM, flew it to Washington for the president to see. And close to Soldier of Fortune, I've mentioned this before, but I bring it up again, is Michael Ledeen, who writes editorials for Soldier of Fortune, August 1984. He has one on violence and terrorism in South and Central America, and it says Michael Ledeen is a senior fellow in international affairs at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown. Now, I wanted to spend time continuing from the news to Michael Ledeen and Mr. Pazienza and the stories that are going on in New York City, the arrest of Pazienza, the death of Grace Kelly's brother and her brother-in-law, and the Vatican scandals that link to Ronald Reagan. I won't have time to continue that, but going the transition that I have here, and we'll do as much as we have time for, and then continue it next week. One of the common denominators is Michael Ledeen, because of his close links to the Vatican, to Licio Gelli, the P2, to the Italian secret police, and Ronald Reagan and Georgetown. Then Michael Ledeen is the connection to John Singlaub, Soldier of Fortune, Robert Brown, Alexander Haig. So that these people that are making our movies, that are sending out this propaganda and inciting people to be fearful of the invasion of the Russians, and teaches how we will suffer under their hands and what we should sacrifice when they arrive in this country, are closely linked also with Alexander Haig. Haig is close to Ledeen. Ledeen worked for Alexander Haig in the State Department. Ledeen works for Mr. Brown, sends letters to the Soldier of Fortune. He has links to the disinformation on the shooting of Pope to try to make it a KGB plot. So that these various names, whether it's William Simon or John Singlaub or John or Michael Ledeen, weave in and out of the acquisition of studios, of movies, and propaganda. And I bring up the name of Ledeen and Red Dawn and Haig right now because with Mr. Murdoch taking over 20th Century Fox, there's a studio that will be absolutely influenced the way that Kirk Kerkorian and Alexander Haig are influenced, and unless the stockholders realize that they're getting propaganda and bad movies that don't make money, nothing will happen except propaganda, and they'll be subsidized by the CIA for making the bad movies. But the intelligence communications system has for a long time been influential in Hollywood, but it's more apparent now, and with Murdoch going to Hollywood, I'm sure he'll do to the movies what he did to the Chicago Sun, and sanitize the quality of the kinds of films that people deserve that they're not going to be able to get. I'll begin with this part on Grace Kelly and do as much as I can, as much as time allows, and hopefully pick it up next week. In November of 1982, November the 2nd, 1982, I wrote a story for the National Examiner, Why Grace Kelly Was Murdered. And I put in the article the fact that she had close links to the Vatican, that Roberta Calvi had just been killed in June, that she was either a spy or a courier for the Vatican, and the Examiner had a picture of John Paul, and inside the Vatican another picture of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus and Roberta Calvi, and I mentioned that Paul Marcinkus was privy to the secret $1.2 billion that was missing out of the Vatican bank, and that Michael Sindona was in prison, the God's banker, and that 7 people had been linked to the scandal, the Vatican scandal, and had been murdered just before Grace Kelly was murdered, who had a wind of what was going on, and referred to another witness who lived near Grace Kelly, who later was murdered, called the exterminator, who killed an investigator for Michael Sindona. And in this article, I quoted various statements from the book, The Vatican Connection by Richard Hammer, and the role of the mafia, the Vatican, and the hierarchy, the P2, Licio Gelli, and the role in the terrorist bombings in Bologna, and that the relationship of Licio Gelli to Prince Rainier in Monte Carlo was very close, that he went to Monte Carlo. In fact, when he left Italy and fled, the Prince Rainier and Grace Kelly had taken care of him there. She was part of the P2 Lodge there, as is Henry Kissinger, and so was Roy Cohn. And in this article, I talked about Gelli's Masonic Lodge, and he was arrested in Switzerland the night before Grace's car crashed. He was arrested one evening, and the very next day she was killed, and that her connections to the Vatican were just too tangled, going there allegedly to make movies, and that among other people, Grace's sister, Mrs. Peggy Conlon, is quoted as saying that she thought foul play was involved in the death of the princess. Now, I wrote this a long time ago. That was in 1982, November the 2nd, 1982. I have reprints or can copy it if you want copies of this article. It just so happened that 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Peggy Conlon, her sister-in-law's husband, dropped dead several hours after Grace's brother dropped dead, and just before they died, Mr. Pazienza of the Vatican, the P2, was arrested in New York City. Right after they died, 2 days later, he was arrested in New York City, and Pazienza was fingered as being one of the people behind the murder of Aldo Moro, of Roberta Calvi, whose picture I had here, and also, interestingly enough, besides the arrest of Pazienza, and I'll go into that next week if we don't have time now, Archbishop Marcinkus, I mentioned, was in Palm Springs with Bob Hope several weeks ago, and I knew something very important was going to happen in terms of the Vatican. And right after Marcinkus went back to Italy, Grace Kelly's brother was killed, and her brother-in-law, whose wife was vocal right from the beginning about the murder of Grace Kelly, were killed, and Pazienza was arrested in New York City. And there isn't time to go into this complicated story now. I probably shouldn't have even started to bring it up, but the common denominator, as I said before, is Michael Ledeen to the Pazienza story, and Michael Ledeen to Soldier of Fortune, and John Singlaub, and the other connections that I was going back to. These various important stories have common denominators that link them all together. I don't have time to go into the Grace Kelly story, her brothers, or Mr. Pazienza, because there are some interesting articles I want to share with you on that. So we'll do that next week. I'll pick that up next week and then continue with some more of the current things that have been happening in the news. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell, and this program emanates from KAZU in Pacific Grove, California.